Chapter 1. The Echo of Silence. The damp earth clung to Lyra's bare soles as she navigated the labyrinthine roots of the Blackroot Forest. To anyone else, this place was a graveyard of tangled thorns and predatory shadows. But to her, it was a symphony of vibrations. She didn't need eyes to see the way the wind hummed through the silver-leafed oaks or how the brook bubbled like a pot of simmering honey over smooth stones. Her world was built on the texture of bark under her calloused palms and the sharp medicinal tang of wild yarrow. Isolation wasn't just a choice, it was her sanctuary, because the world of the sighted had proven far more treacherous than any dark wood. She knelt by a cluster of damp moss, her fingers dancing lightly over the flora, until she found the fuzzy stems of mullein. Why did the silence feel so heavy today? Usually, the forest breathed with her, but this afternoon, the air felt thick, like unspun wool clogging her lungs. A twig snapped 60 paces to the north. It wasn't the light, erratic crack of a foraging squirrel or the heavy, rhythmic thud of a bear. This was deliberate. Something massive was displacing the air, moving with a predatory grace that sent a frantic shiver racing down her spine. "I know you're there," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the vast expanse of the clearing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stayed perfectly still, her head tilted to catch the slightest shift in the atmosphere. The intruder didn't growl. It didn't retreat. Instead, a scent began to coil around her. Wild cedar, frozen rain, and a drop of something metallic that smelled like ancient power. It was a fragrance that didn't belong to the Blackroot, yet it felt more familiar than her own name. How long had this phantom been trailing her? For 3 days, the sensation of being watched had prickled the back of her neck while she gathered herbs or scrubbed her wooden bowls. She lived in a small cabin, a fortress of solitude she had built after the Great Rejection. Yet this presence felt like it could walk through walls. Her mind flashed back to the serrated edge of the Alpha's voice during the ceremony, the way he had spat the word useless in front of 1,000 wolves. Being blind was her crime, and exile was her only mercy. She stood up, clutching her basket of herbs to her chest as if it were a shield. "Are you hungry?" she asked the shadows, her tone surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Or are you just waiting for me to trip?" She didn't expect an answer, but the air rippled. A low, resonant vibration hummed through the soles of her feet, almost like a purr but deeper, reaching into the marrow of her bones. It was the sound of a beast that knew it had already won. She turned back toward her cabin, her pace measured to hide the trembling in her knees. Every step felt like a gamble. She could feel the heat of the creature's gaze on her shoulder blades, a heavy golden weight that seemed to physically touch her skin. Why hadn't it attacked yet? The Blackroot didn't offer protection. It offered a hiding place, but she realized with a jolt of terror that she was no longer hidden. As she reached her door, she paused, her hand hovering over the iron latch. She could hear the heavy, slow inhalation of the beast just beyond the tree line. It was watching her with a patience that was terrifying because it suggested she was already caught. "Good night, Shadow," she murmured, slipping inside and barring the door. The wood felt thin. The silence felt loud. She wondered if the creature knew that she could feel the heat of its body through the logs, a silent sentinel that refused to leave her side.
Chapter 2. The Ghost of the Blackroot. Kael suppressed the urge to shift back into his human skin, his massive paws sinking silently into the loam. His wolf was a tempest of silver and midnight, a creature of war and crown, yet here he was, reduced to a stalker in the underbrush. He watched the girl, his mate, as she moved with a devastating elegance through the treacherous terrain. She was blind, yet she navigated the thorns better than his elite scouts. Her hair was a tangled halo of chestnut, and her skin bore the pale glow of someone who lived in the half-light of the canopy. He had heard the rumors of the broken Omega cast out by the northern reach, but the woman before him was anything but broken. She was a marvel of survival, her fingers moving with surgical precision as she harvested the forest's secrets. His wolf howled internally, a primal demand to claim what was theirs, but Kael held the beast back with an iron will. He had seen the way she flinched at sudden sounds. He knew the history written in the tension of her shoulders, the history of a male who had seen her as a defect rather than a miracle. "You've been following me for days, haven't you?" Her voice cut through his reverie, soft but piercing. Kael froze, his golden eyes narrowing. She was sharper than he had anticipated. Most alphas couldn't track him when he didn't want to be found, yet this fragile female had sensed him through the veil of her darkness. He watched her whisper to the trees, her face turned toward his hiding spot. She looked vulnerable, standing there with her small basket, yet her spirit felt like a wildfire, untamable and scorching. His mind drifted to the capital, the throne of the Alpha King that felt like a cage of gold. His people expected a queen of stature, a warrior who could lead armies, but his soul was tethered to this lonely girl in the mud. He remembered the reports of her rejection, the public humiliation she had endured, because her eyes didn't see the world the way others did. They were fools. They hadn't seen her stand her ground against the silence of the Blackroot. He watched her retreat to her cabin, her movements fluid and haunting. When she invited him to return, a surge of possessive heat flared in his chest, making his fur stand on end. She was offering him a place in her world, even if she didn't know who, or what, he really was. The danger was escalating. His spies had reported movement from the northern reach, her old pack sniffing around the borders like starving curs. They didn't deserve to breathe the same air as her, let alone reclaim what they had discarded. Kael circled the cabin, his claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. He would stay. He would guard the perimeter until the sun burned away the mist. He wasn't just a king observing a subject. He was a man witnessing the only thing that had ever made his heart beat with purpose. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most powerful alpha in the territories was now the devoted guardian of a woman who didn't even know his name. As the moon reached its zenith, he settled into the tall grass near her window. He could hear her heartbeat inside, a steady, rhythmic thrum that acted as a lullaby for his restless wolf. Why did fate play such cruel games? He was the king of wolves, and she was the pariah of the forest. Yet the bond between them felt like a rope of braided steel. He would wait for the right moment to reveal himself, but for now he was content to be the monster that kept the other monsters away.
Chapter 3. The Guardian in the Dark. The morning brought a coat of silver frost and the haunting realization that she was no longer alone in her solitude. Lyra opened her door to find the scent of the wolf even stronger than the night before, a musk of dominance and safety that made her breath hitch. She stepped onto the porch, her feet finding the familiar divots in the wood. Near the bottom step, the earth had been churned up. She knelt, her fingers tracing the outline of a massive paw print in the mud. It was twice the size of any wolf she had ever encountered. "You stayed," she whispered to the empty air, a small, involuntary smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. For years, she had convinced herself that she needed nothing but the forest, but the presence of the beast felt like a warm blanket on a winter night. She went about her chores, but her senses were dialed to the maximum. She felt the shift in the wind when he moved, the way the birds fell silent in a localized circle around his position. He was a shadow that protected, a phantom that breathed. As the day progressed, the forest felt different, charged with an electric tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. She headed toward the stream to wash her linens, her ears picking up a distant, discordant sound. It wasn't the wolf. This was the metallic clatter of armor and the harsh, braying laughter of men who didn't respect the woods. Her heart sank. The northern reach hunters. They had a habit of venturing into the Blackroot to test their mettle, often leaving behind a trail of blood and broken trees. She tried to move quietly, but the fear made her clumsy. A stone slipped under her foot and she stumbled, the splash of her water bucket echoing like a gunshot in the quiet grove. "Did you hear that?" a voice called out, rough and laced with malice. "Sounds like we found the little blind bitch." The laughter that followed was cold, a sound she hadn't heard since the day she was cast out. They were coming for her, not for food or sport, but for the sheer cruelty of reminding her what she was. Lyra scrambled to her feet, her hands searching for the familiar path, but the panic blurred her internal map. The forest seemed to twist and turn, the trees reaching out to snag her clothes like skeletal fingers. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their heavy boots destroying the delicate moss she worked so hard to protect. "Run, Lyra!" she hissed to herself, her lungs burning as she pushed through a thicket of thorns. Suddenly, a terrifying roar ripped through the air, a sound so primal it felt like the sky was tearing open. It wasn't a bark or a howl, it was a declaration of war. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with the force of a massive body hitting the earth at full speed. The screams of the hunters followed quickly, replaced by the wet, sickening crunch of bone and the frantic thrashing of men who had realized too late that they weren't the apex predators here. She froze, her back against a rough cedar trunk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The violence was over in seconds. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. Then, she heard it, the slow, heavy tread of the wolf approaching her. He didn't rush. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace until she could feel the heat radiating from his massive chest. She reached out, her hand trembling, until her fingertips brushed against fur that felt like thick, heated velvet. He was there. He had saved her. And in that moment, the wall she had built around her heart began to crumble, leaving her more vulnerable than she had ever been in the dark. Chapter 4. The Velvet Shadow. The copper tang of fresh blood hung heavy in the humid air, a stark contrast to the usual scent of rain-washed pine. Lyra remained frozen against the cedar bark, her fingers still buried in the thick, coarse fur of the creature that had just decimated her tormentors. She expected a snarl or the snap of bone-crushing jaws, yet the beast remained unnervingly still. He felt like a mountain of living heat, a massive presence that shielded her from the lingering echoes of the hunter's dying whimpers. Her heart, once a frantic drum, began to find a slower, more rhythmic pace, as she realized the monster wasn't looking at her as prey. You killed them," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She didn't feel the horror she thought she should. Instead, a forbidden sense of relief washed over her, cooling the fever of her panic. Her hand drifted upward, tracing the powerful curve of a shoulder that felt like solid granite wrapped in velvet. The wolf let out a huff of air, a warm gust that ruffled her hair and smelled of wild mint and ancient earth. It was a sophisticated scent, far too clean for a feral animal, yet she didn't question the impossibility of it. Because she was blind, the world was often a place of sharp edges and sudden collisions. But this interaction felt fluid. She stepped away from the tree, her legs still feeling like jelly, and the wolf moved with her, pressing his flank against her thigh to steady her. It was a gesture of profound intimacy that no alpha had ever shown her, not even the one who had once promised to cherish her. He guided her back toward the cabin, his footsteps silent while hers crunched clumsily over the debris of the skirmish. Why was a king of the forest playing the part of a walking stick for a broken Omega? As they reached the porch, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a chill over the Blackroot that usually sent Lyra scurrying for her hearth. Today, she lingered. She felt the wolf's gaze on her, a physical weight that seemed to read the secrets written in the lines of her face. "You saved me from the northern reach," she said, her fingers catching on a burr in his coat. She carefully plucked it out, her touch lingering on the skin beneath. "Nobody has ever fought for me before. Usually they just fight over who has to deal with me." The wolf leaned his massive head into her palm, a low vibration rumbling through his chest that felt suspiciously like a purr. It was a sound of comfort, a resonant hum that seemed to stitch together the jagged pieces of her shattered nerves. She felt a strange magnetic pull toward him, a tugging at her navel that ignored all logic and survival instinct. Was it possible to feel a mate bond with a beast that couldn't speak? The thought was madness, yet as she turned the iron latch of her door, she found herself hesitating on the threshold. "You can come back tomorrow night," she murmured, her face heating up at the boldness of the invitation. "If you want, I have some dried venison. It isn't much, but it's yours." She didn't wait for a response she knew he couldn't give, slipping inside the cabin and leaning her back against the wood. The silence of the room felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a waiting room. She could hear him settling down on the porch, his heavy body thumping against the floorboards as he took up his post. She lay in her bed that night, the quilt pulled up to her chin, listening to the steady breathing of the guardian outside. For the first time in 3 years, the nightmares of the rejection ceremony didn't come to claim her. Instead, she dreamt of golden eyes and the feeling of being cherished by a shadow. She wondered if he was lonely too, or if he was simply a ghost sent by the forest to ensure she didn't fade away entirely. The mystery of him was a hook in her soul, pulling her toward a future she had long ago forbidden herself from imagining.
Chapter 5. The King's Humility. Kael watched the moon climb the sky from his position on the creaking porch, his wolf reveling in the scent of the female sleeping just inches away. The slaughter in the woods had been necessary, a brutal reminder to the northern reach that some territories were governed by a higher power than their petty laws. He had enjoyed the feeling of their throats collapsing under his teeth, a dark satisfaction that only grew when he saw Lyra reach for him. Touching her was like plunging his paws into a lightning storm, a jagged, beautiful agony that made his human soul scream for release. He shifted his weight, his claws clicking softly against the wood. He was the Alpha King, a man who commanded legions and held the fate of nations in his palms, yet he was currently acting as a rug for a woman who didn't know his name. The absurdity of it should have stung his pride, but instead, it felt like the only right thing he had done in decades. In the capital, everyone wanted something from him: power, gold, or blood. Lyra only offered him dried venison and a gentle hand. Why did she live like this, in a hovel at the edge of the world when she deserved a palace of marble and silk? He knew the answer, and it made his blood boil until it felt like molten lead in his veins. The rejection bond was a poison that lingered, a spiritual wound that convinced the victim they were worthless. He could smell the faint, lingering bitterness of that old trauma on her skin, mixed with the sweet, intoxicating aroma of her own essence. He wanted to hunt down the male who had rejected her and peel the skin from his bones, but for now, his priority was the girl. As the first light of dawn touched the trees, Kael rose and moved toward the window, peering through the glass at her sleeping form. She looked so small beneath the heavy furs, her breathing shallow and peaceful. He debated shifting then, of stepping into the room and wrapping his human arms around her, but he stopped himself. If she woke to find a naked stranger in her home, the trust he had painstakingly built would vanish like mist. He had to be patient. He had to be the wolf until she was ready for the man. He spent the morning clearing the perimeter, ensuring no lingering scouts remained to threaten her peace. He found a patch of wild berries nearby and nudged a basket she had left outside toward them, a silent suggestion for her morning meal. Every act was a calculated move in a game of emotional chess, but the stakes were his very heart. He felt the bond tightening, a golden cord that hummed whenever she was near, demanding that he claim her, mark her, and hide her from a world that didn't deserve her. By midday, he sensed a shift in the forest, a heavy, magical resonance that signaled the arrival of something ancient. He wasn't the only one interested in the Blackroot. There were whispers of a prophecy, a blind seer who would bridge the gap between the warring packs, and he realized with a jolt of dread that Lyra was no longer just a hermit. She was a target. His protective instinct flared, his hackles rising as he scanned the tree line for any sign of the unseen watchers. He returned to the porch just as she stepped outside, her face tilted toward the sun. She looked radiant, the light catching the gold in her hair and making her appear like a forest deity. "You're still here," she said, her voice a melody that settled the storm in his chest. Kael let out a soft huff, stepping forward to nudge her hand with his wet nose. He would stay forever if she let him. He would burn the world to the ground to keep that look of peace on her face, even if it meant he remained a ghost in her world.
Chapter 6. The Language of the Heart. The week passed in a blur of shared silences and growing intimacy that defied every rule Lyra had ever lived by. The wolf, She began to think of him as him, a person rather than a beast, became a permanent fixture in her life. He was there when she gathered wood, his large body a warm barrier against the biting wind. He was there when she cooked, his head resting on his paws as he watched her move with increasing confidence. Because he was there, she didn't have to listen so hard for danger. She could finally listen to the wind. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Lyra sat on the porch steps, her shoulder leaning against his massive flank. The trust was so thick she could almost taste it, a sweetness like ripe blackberries. "I was supposed to be a Luna," she said suddenly, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "My father was a Beta. He raised me to lead, to be strong. But when the light went out of my eyes, the strength didn't matter to them anymore. My mate, he didn't just reject me. He made it a show." She felt the wolf stiffen beneath her, a low, dangerous rumble starting in his throat. She reached out, stroking his ears to soothe him. "It's okay. It was a long time ago, but it taught me that love is a tether. It's a way for people to pull you down when you get too high. I promised myself I'd never let anyone have that cord again." She paused, her fingers tangling in the silver fur. "But you don't want to lead me. You just want to be with me. Why?" The wolf didn't answer with a sound, but he shifted, sliding his head into her lap and looking up at her with eyes she could feel burning through her skin. It was a gesture of total submission, an alpha of his stature offering his throat to an omega. It was the most profound thing anyone had ever done for her. Tears pricked her sightless eyes, spilling over and disappearing into his fur. For the first time since the exile, she felt seen. She felt like more than a defect or a burden. That night, as the temperature plummeted, she didn't leave him on the porch. "It's too cold," she said, holding the door open. "Come in." He hesitated, his massive frame nearly filling the doorway, before stepping into her small sanctum. The room felt tiny with him in it, his presence radiating a heat that made the fireplace seem redundant. He settled by the bed, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, guarding her even in the safety of her home. As she drifted off to sleep, she reached out her hand, finding the tip of his ear in the dark. "What do you look like?" she whispered into the shadows. "I bet you're beautiful. I bet you have eyes like the sun." She didn't see the way the wolf's form shimmered for a second, the moonlight catching the momentary outline of a man's broad shoulders before the image vanished. She didn't see the agony of longing in his expression, a king trapped in a silent skin, desperate to tell her that she was the only light he had ever needed. The peace of the cabin was a fragile thing, a bubble of safety in a forest that was growing increasingly hostile. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and iron from a direction that wasn't hers. The northern reach was gathering, their scouts reporting back about the black wolf that guarded the blind girl. They didn't know they were hunting a king, but they knew they wanted revenge. As Lyra slept, the first of the hunters crossed the border, their blades sharpened for a task they wouldn't survive, setting the stage for a betrayal that would shatter the world she had just begun to build. Chapter 7. The Fragile Sanctuary. The hearth glowed with the dying embers of cedar, casting a warmth that felt hollow compared to the massive creature resting at the foot of Lyra's bed. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, dancing across her sightless eyes, but she didn't need vision to know he was still there. The air was saturated with his scent, rain-drenched earth, and a sharp, metallic spice that made her pulse skip a beat. Every morning for a week, she had woken to this same heavy, comforting presence, and every morning the fear of losing it grew sharper than the cold mountain air. She swung her legs over the side of the mattress, her toes brushing against the coarse, thick fur of the wolf's flank. He didn't growl. He simply huffed a warm breath against her ankle, a silent greeting that felt more intimate than any spoken word. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice thick with the remnants of sleep. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find you were just a dream the forest conjured to keep me from going mad." She reached down, her fingers navigating the muscular landscape of his back, marveling at the sheer power thrumming beneath his skin. Why would a creature of this magnitude choose a life of silence in a drafty cabin with a woman who couldn't even see his face? The question haunted her as she moved to the small kitchenette to prepare a meager breakfast of oatcakes and dried berries. She could hear him rising, his claws clicking rhythmically on the floorboards as he followed her every movement. He didn't crowd her, but he was always within arm's reach, a living shadow that seemed to anticipate when she might trip over a loose board or miss the handle of the kettle. "You're too quiet for someone so big," she teased, though her heart wasn't entirely in the joke. The intimacy was becoming a weight, a golden tether that pulled at the scars of her old rejection. She remembered the alpha of her former pack, a man who had claimed to love her until the darkness in her eyes became an inconvenience to his pride. Love was a trap, a mechanism of control, yet the wolf offered her nothing but freedom and protection. He didn't demand she be anything other than what she was, a girl surviving in the weeds. She sat at her small wooden table, and she felt the heavy weight of his chin come to rest on her knee. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a predator offering his throat to a prey animal. "I wish I could see you," she murmured, her thumb tracing the bridge of his velvet nose. "Just for a second, just to know if the picture I've built in my head is real." She imagined him with eyes the color of molten amber and a coat that shimmered like polished obsidian under a harvest moon. The wolf let out a low, mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through her bones and made her breath hitch in her throat. For a heartbeat, the air in the cabin shifted, becoming thick with a sudden, suffocating heat. The scent of wild cedar intensified until it was almost dizzying, and she felt a hand, not a paw, but a warm, calloused human hand, brush against her hair. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. But when she reached out to grab it, there was only the coarse fur of the wolf again. Had she imagined it? The loneliness of the Blackroot played tricks on the mind, but the sensation had felt so vivid, so real. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I need to go to the spring," she said, her voice trembling. "The water barrels are low." She grabbed her buckets and hurried out the door, the cool air hitting her face like a bucket of ice water. She needed distance, yet as she walked the familiar path to the water, she knew he was right behind her, a silent guardian who would never truly let her go.
Chapter 8. The Shadow King's Burden. Kael watched Lyra from the edge of the clearing, his wolf's body tensed and ready to spring at the slightest hint of trouble. Being near her in this form was a double-edged sword. It allowed him to protect her without the baggage of his crown, but it also kept him from the one thing he craved most, to hear her say his name. Every time she touched him, his human soul roared against the cage of his ribs, demanding to shift, to speak, to claim her as the queen of the lichened territories. But he knew the fragility of her trust, a glass sculpture that would shatter at the first sign of deception. He had spent the early hours of the dawn hunting, but not for meat. He had been hunting the scouts of the Northern Reach, those pathetic curs who thought they could reclaim what they had so cruelly discarded. He had left their bodies as a warning at the border, a grisly fence of flesh and bone that screamed of his ownership. They wouldn't come back today, but the scent of war was on the wind, a bitter metallic tang that even the pine needles couldn't mask. The king was away from his throne for too long, and his advisors were likely already whispering of coups and betrayals. "What do you look like?" Her voice echoed in his mind, a soft, haunting refrain that made him want to weep. He wanted to tell her that he was a man who had spent his life surrounded by beauty, but had never seen anything as radiant as her standing in the mud. He wanted to tell her that his eyes were gold because they were searching for the sun, and he had found it in her. Instead, he nudged his nose into her palm, offering the only comfort he was allowed to give in this skin. He watched her at the spring, her movements fluid and practiced as she dipped the wooden buckets into the icy water. She was a marvel of adaptation, a woman who had turned her disability into a dance. But as she turned to head back, Kael's ears swiveled toward the south. A new scent had entered the woods, Something old, something rotten. It wasn't the northern reach. This was something darker, a rogue element that didn't follow the laws of the packs. His hackles rose, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest that made Lyra freeze in her tracks. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is someone there?" Kael didn't answer. He couldn't. He stepped in front of her, his massive body a wall of fur and muscle between her and the tree line. He could see them now, 3 ragged figures with eyes that burned with a feverish, unnatural light. Rogues. They were starving, desperate, and driven by a madness that made them ignore the obvious danger of an Alpha King's presence. Kael didn't wait for them to make the first move. He launched himself across the clearing, a blur of silver and shadow that hit the lead rogue with the force of a falling star. The sounds of the struggle were brutal. The snap of jaws, the tearing of cloth, and the frantic yelps of creatures who realized too late that they had hunted the wrong prey. He dispatched them with a cold, efficient violence, his mind focused entirely on the woman standing by the spring, her hands over her ears to drown out the sounds of the slaughter. When the last rogue lay still in the dirt, Kael didn't immediately return to her. He licked the blood from his muzzles, his heart hammering with a frantic, protective rage. He realized then that he couldn't keep her here much longer. The forest was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the wolves were closing in. He walked back to her, his gait heavy with the weight of the secret he carried. He leaned his head against her shoulder, and for a moment he let himself imagine that they were just 2 souls lost in the woods, with no crowns and no enemies, just the quiet hum of a bond that refused to break.
Chapter 9. The Breaking of the Veil. The smell of blood was back, but this time it was different, wilder, more desperate. Lyra sat on the porch, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron into knots. The wolf was restless, his pacing a constant rhythmic thrum against the wood that set her teeth on edge. Something had changed in the forest since the spring. A darkening of the atmosphere that felt like a storm brewing just over the horizon. She felt small, a tiny bird caught in the path of a hurricane, and for the first time her independence felt like a lie. "You're worried," she said, her voice trembling as she reached out to find him in the dark. He stopped his pacing immediately, his head finding her hand with an urgency that startled her. "I can feel the tension in the air, it's like the trees are holding their breath." She felt him shiver beneath her touch, a tremor that seemed to come from his very soul. "Is it my old pack? Are they coming to take me back to that cage?" The thought of returning to the northern reach made her stomach turn with a cold, sharp nausea. The wolf let out a sound she had never heard before, a low, melodic hum that sounded almost like a song. He stepped closer, his body pressing against her knees, and suddenly, he began to push her toward the door. He was insistent, his head nudging her shoulder until she stood up and retreated into the cabin. He followed her inside, but instead of settling by the bed, he went to the window, his ears alert to every snap of a twig in the distance. "You're trying to hide me," she realized, a soft laugh escaping her lips, though it was devoid of mirth. "You're a very protective shadow, aren't you?" She moved toward the hearth to stoke the fire, but her foot caught on the edge of the rug, and she stumbled. She expected the floor, but instead, she found something warm and solid. 2 arms wrapped around her waist, catching her with a strength that was unmistakably human. The skin was hot against her own, and the scent of cedar and rain exploded in her senses. She froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The arms were muscular, the chest she was pressed against broad and hard as a shield. "Who are you?" she gasped, her hands reaching up to touch the face of the man who held her. Her fingers found a sharp jawline, the softness of a beard, and the heat of a mouth that was inches from her own. He didn't speak, but his breath was shaky against her forehead. For a fleeting second, the veil of her world seemed to lift, and she felt a connection so deep it reached into her past and her future simultaneously. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the heat vanished. She heard the sound of a heavy body hitting the floor, and the familiar coarse fur was back under her hands. She was standing alone in the center of the room, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. What was that? She whispered, her voice echoing in the small space. The wolf didn't answer, but he let out a long, low howl that sounded like a lament for a life he couldn't have. Outside, the silence of the Blackroot was finally broken. The sound of a dozen horses, their hooves thundering against the earth, approached the cabin. Shouts rang out, familiar voices from her past filled with a misplaced authority. The Northern Reach had arrived, and they hadn't come for a visit. They had come for the property they had lost, unaware that they were stepping into the den of a king. Lyra felt the wolf move to the door, his body bristling with a lethal intent, and she knew that the secret of the forest was about to be revealed in a spray of red and a roar of gold. Chapter 10. The Iron Scent of the Past. The thunder of hooves didn't just vibrate in the earth, it rattled the very bones of my cabin. I could feel the structure groaning under the weight of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Beside me, the wolf, my silent silver shadow, transformed. He didn't change his shape, but his energy sharpened into a jagged blade of pure lethality. A low, vibrating snarl started deep in his chest, a sound so primal it made the tea in my tin cup ripple. This wasn't the protective hum of a guardian anymore. This was the war cry of a king. "Lyra, open this door before we splinter it!" The voice hit me like a physical blow, a jagged shard of ice cutting through the warmth of my sanctuary. It was Silas, the Beta's son from the Northern Reach, the man who had held the torch during my rejection ceremony, while the pack laughed at my sightless tears. Hearing his voice brought back the smell of wood smoke and the taste of humiliation, a bitter bile rising in my throat. They weren't here to rescue me. They were here to reclaim an object they had realized was missing from their inventory. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the wolf's bristling neck. Please don't let them in," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic bird in a cage. The wolf didn't move toward the door. Instead, he stepped in front of me, his massive body a living shield of fur and fury. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a volcanic intensity that seemed to push back the chill of the intruders. He was the only thing standing between me and a life of servitude. The door didn't splinter, it exploded. The iron latch snapped with a sickening crack, and the smell of wet horses and polished leather flooded the room. I heard the heavy thud of boots on my floorboards. At least 4 men, their breathing ragged and arrogant. "Look at this," Silas sneered, his voice closer now. "The little blind bitch found herself a pet. A big one, too. Move aside, beast, before we make a rug out of you." The wolf didn't move. The silence that followed was thick, a suffocating blanket of tension that made my skin crawl. Then, a sound I had never heard before ripped through the room, a roar so loud it felt like the walls were collapsing. It wasn't just an animal's cry, it was a command that forced the air out of the lungs of every man in the room. I heard the clatter of a sword hitting the floor and a sharp, pained gasp from Silas. The wolf had moved, a blur of motion I couldn't see but could certainly feel as the wind of his passage whipped my hair across my face. What is that thing?" Another voice stammered, his bravado vanishing into a thin wheeze of terror. "Silas, its eyes, they aren't normal, they're gold, pure gold." I stood frozen, my hands clutching the back of my chair until the wood bit into my palms. Gold? Wolves of the Blackroot had green or brown eyes. Only the royal bloodlines, the alphas of the High Throne, carried the mark of the sun. The realization hit me with the force of a landslide, a truth so heavy I could barely breathe. My protector wasn't just a wolf. He was something far more dangerous.
Chapter 11. The King Unmasked. Kael struggled to keep his human skin from bursting through his fur as he pinned the Northern Reach Beta against the wall. His claws were buried inches deep into the wood on either side of the man's head, his fangs bared in a silent promise of decapitation. These pathetic, small-minded curs had dared to step into her home, to speak to her like she was nothing more than a strayed dog. Every instinct he possessed screamed for him to shift, to wrap his hands around Silas's throat and squeeze until the life fled his treacherous eyes. But he couldn't. Not yet. Lyra was behind him, her face a mask of pale terror and confusion. If he shifted now, he would be a naked stranger in the wreckage of her home, a king who had lied to her for weeks. He forced his wolf back, the effort making his muscles twitch with agony. "Leave," he growled, the word vibrating through his chest in a way that sounded almost human, a distorted guttural command that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Silas was trembling, his scent a foul mixture of sweat and cowardice. You can't have her," the beta stammered, though he didn't dare move a muscle. "She's ours. The Alpha wants her back. There's a prophecy, the blind seer. She belongs to the Reach." Kael's response was a snap of his jaws an inch from the man's nose. He didn't care about prophecies or pack laws. He cared about the woman who had plucked burrs from his fur and shared her meager meals with a shadow. Behind him, he heard Lyra's voice, small and fragile. "I don't belong to anyone, Silas, especially not a pack that threw me to the crows." Her words were a spark in the dark, and Kael felt a surge of pride that nearly broke his concentration. She was standing tall, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of the intruders, her spirit refusing to bow even when she was surrounded by enemies. She was a queen in every way that mattered, and he would be damned if he let these scavengers touch her. The other 3 hunters were backing toward the door, their weapons lowered. They weren't warriors, they were bullies, and they knew when they were outmatched by a superior predator. "This isn't over," Silas hissed, though his voice lacked conviction as he scrambled toward the exit. "The Alpha will come himself next time. He'll bring the whole pack." Kael followed them to the porch, his snarl echoing through the trees until the sound of their horses faded into the distance. He turned back to the cabin, his heart heavy with the weight of the coming storm. The veil was slipping. He could feel Lyra's gaze, if you could call it that, searching for him, her senses tuned to the frequency of his lies. He walked toward her, his paws heavy on the floorboards, and stopped a few feet away. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but the scent of blood and anger still clung to him like a shroud. He was the Alpha King, and his presence had just brought the very war she had spent years trying to escape right to her doorstep.
Chapter 12. The Threshold of Truth. The cabin felt cold now, the broken door allowing the biting wind of the Blackroot to whistle through the room. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands tucked into my sleeves to stop the shaking. The silence was different tonight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the forest, but the heavy, expectant silence of a courtroom. The wolf was sitting by the hearth, his breathing slow and rhythmic, but I could feel the electricity crackling off him. He was waiting for me to say it. He was waiting for me to acknowledge the impossible. "You're not a wolf, are you?" I asked, my voice a mere whisper in the drafty room. The air seemed to freeze. I didn't hear a movement, but I felt the shift. A sudden, intense heat that blossomed in the center of the room, followed by the sound of bone shifting and skin stretching. It was a wet, visceral sound that should have terrified me, but instead, it felt like a melody I had been waiting to hear. A heavy, human sigh followed, a sound filled with so much exhaustion and longing that it brought tears to my eyes. I heard the soft thud of bare feet on the wood, a slow, deliberate approach. "Lyra," a voice said. It was the same voice from the dream, the one that smelled of cedar and rain, but clearer now, more resonant. It was a voice of command, of ancient lineage, yet it trembled with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "I never meant for them to find you. I never meant to bring the world to your door." I reached out, my fingers searching the empty air until they found him. This time, I didn't find fur. My palm pressed against a warm, smooth chest, the skin stretched tight over hard muscle. I followed the line of his throat up to a sharp jawline, my thumb brushing against a bottom lip that was full and trembling. He was taller than I imagined, a giant of a man who felt like a mountain of sun-warmed stone. "Who are you?" I whispered, my fingers tracing the bridge of his nose, the high cheekbones, and finally, the closed lids of his eyes. "My name is Kael," he said, his breath hitching as I touched his face. "And I am the king of the territories you've spent your life hiding from. But to you, I am just the shadow that watched you sleep." The weight of his words was staggering. A king. The king. The man whose name was whispered in fear by every pack in the north was standing in my broken cabin, naked and humble before a blind exile. It was a story out of a myth, a joke of the fates that I couldn't wrap my mind around. But as I touched the crown of his head, feeling the thick, silky hair that I had only known as coarse fur, I realized something else. The fear wasn't there. The rejection, the humiliation, the pain of the past, it all felt small compared to the heat of his skin against mine. "You stayed," I murmured, my forehead coming to rest against his chest. "Even when you didn't have to. Why?" He didn't answer with words. He simply wrapped his large, powerful arms around me and pulled me into his heat, holding me as if I were the most precious treasure in his kingdom. Outside, the forest roared with the coming storm, the trees thrashing against a sky that had turned bruised and purple. The northern reach was gathering, their alpha fueled by a greed that would lead them to their graves. But inside the cabin, for one brief, flickering moment, there was only the sound of two hearts beating in unison, a king and an omega, bound by a secret that was about to set the world on fire. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. Chapter 13. The Echo of Iron. The warmth of Kael's embrace was a fleeting sunbeam before a winter storm. I could still feel the phantom heat of his skin against my palms, the terrifyingly beautiful reality of a king standing in my ruined kitchen. But the air outside had turned toxic. The scent of wood smoke wasn't coming from my hearth. It was the smell of wet torches and the acrid stench of silver-dipped steel. My skin prickled with 1,000 invisible needles as the forest, usually my symphony of safety, began to scream in a language of snapping branches and muffled curses. "Stay behind me." Kael's voice dropped an octave, vibrating through the floorboards like a low-frequency tectonic shift. I heard the visceral, wet slide of his transformation, the snap of bone and the rustle of fur, as he returned to the wolf. He didn't have time to explain his kingdom or his secrets, because the Northern Reach hadn't sent scouts this time. They had sent a harvesting party. I reached out, my fingers catching only a tuft of his silver mane before a heavy thud shook the porch. "Lyra, by the decree of the High Alpha, you are reclaimed." The voice wasn't Silas's snivel. It was Thorn, the lead enforcer, a man whose heart was made of the same jagged flint as his axe. I heard the whistle of a projectile, a heavy, weighted net laced with silver thread. It hissed through the air, and Kael let out a roar of agony as the metal burned his hide. I screamed his name, my hands searching the darkness for him, but a rough, gloved hand clamped over my mouth, smelling of stale tobacco and cruelty. I fought like a cornered animal, my nails digging into the leather of my captor's sleeves, but I was an Omega against 3 seasoned warriors. They didn't care about my dignity. They handled me like a sack of grain, hoisting me off my feet while the sounds of Kael's struggle became a frantic, muffled thrashing. "Don't kill the beast yet!" Thorn shouted over the din. "The Alpha wants to see what kind of monster thinks it can hoard our property." I felt the cold bite of iron shackles snap around my wrists, a weight that felt heavier than the world itself. They dragged me toward the tree line, my toes scraping through the dirt I had tended so lovingly. I could hear Kyle's muffled growls, the sound of him tearing at the silver netting that paralyzed his shifter nerves. "Kael!" I shrieked, the name a jagged prayer. I didn't care if he was a king or a ghost. He was the only thing that had ever made the dark feel like home. But the forest swallowed my cry. replaced by the rhythmic, mocking beat of horses' hooves as I was tossed onto a saddle, the world spinning into a dizzying, lightless void.
Chapter 14. The Wrath of the Fallen King. The silver burned like liquid fire, 1,000 stinging hornets boring into my flesh and suppressing the roar of my wolf. I thrashed against the netting, my claws useless against the reinforced mesh, watching through a haze of pain as they hauled Lyra away. They touched her with their filthy, common hands, treating my mate, the future queen of the lichen throne, like a common thief. Every heartbeat was a spike of adrenaline and shame. I had let my guard down for a moment of human warmth, and the price was her freedom. "Look at him," one of the stragglers mocked, poking a silver-tipped spear into my ribs. The great shadow of the Blackroot, reduced to a shivering pile of fur. "Who do you think you are, mutt?" I didn't growl. I didn't snarl. I went perfectly still, letting the rage settle into a cold, diamond-hard focus. My wolf retreated just enough to let my human mind take the wheel. They thought I was a feral beast because I had stayed silent, but they were about to learn that silence is the loudest warning a king can give. With a surge of agony that turned my vision white, I shifted mid-tangle, my human shoulders expanding and snapping the silver cords that were designed to hold a canine shape. The metal sliced into my skin, drawing ribbons of royal blood, but I didn't flinch. I stood up in the wreckage of Lyra's porch, a naked god of vengeance drenched in my own crimson. The hunter's jaw dropped, his spear trembling in his grasp as he stared at the crest of the High King burned into my shoulder. "You," he stammered, his knees hitting the dirt. "Mercy, my lord." "Mercy is a luxury you traded for her," I said, my voice a rasp of gravel and ice. I didn't waste a second. I didn't need a weapon. My hands were enough. I moved with a speed that defied the silver's poison, snapping his neck before he could draw a breath. I didn't look at the body. I looked at the trail they had left in the mud, the broken ferns and the scent of Lyra's terror. They were heading for the Northern Reach stronghold, a fortress built on arrogance and old blood. I let out a howl then, not a cry of pain, but a summons that ripped through the canopy and traveled for miles. My army was stationed 3 leagues to the east, waiting for a sign that their king was ready to return. The sound echoed off the mountains, a promise of total annihilation for anyone who stood between me and my mate. I shifted back into the wolf, the pain of the silver now nothing more than a dull hum beneath the roar of my bloodlust. I would burn their fortress to ash and salt their fields with the blood of their elders before I let them mark her again.
Chapter 15. The Lion's Den. The iron bars of the carriage rattled against my spine, a jarring reminder that my sanctuary had been a delusion. We had traveled for hours, the air growing colder and smelling of the damp limestone caves that housed the Northern Reach's inner sanctum. I sat in the corner of the cage, my sightless eyes fixed on the direction we had come from, hoping, praying, to hear the thunderous paws of a silver guardian. But there was only the mocking whistle of the wind and the occasional jab of a guard's spear against the slats. "Welcome home, Lyra," a voice crooned as the carriage ground to a halt. It was the Alpha, Merrick, the man who had stood over me 3 years ago and told the pack I was a biological error. I felt his presence before he spoke, a heavy, suffocating scent of musk and rotted power. He reached through the bars, his fingers catching a lock of my hair and pulling my head back until my neck arched painfully. "You look well for a corpse. The forest treated you better than you deserved." "Why am I here, Merrick?" I spat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my tears. "You made it clear I was a burden. Why risk the Blackroot for a defect?" He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. He leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Because the elders found the rest of the scrolls, little bird. The blind seer isn't just a title. You are the key to the Great Gateway. The one whose blood can unlock the ancestral powers of the first alphas. You aren't a burden anymore. You're a battery." The horror of his words sank in like a lead weight. They didn't want a mate. They wanted a sacrificial lamb. They planned to use my blindness, the very thing they hated, as a conduit for some ancient, dark magic. I felt a surge of cold fury, a spark of the fire Kael had ignited in me. "You'll never get what you want," I whispered, my voice steady despite the shaking of my hands. "There is something in that forest, something that belongs to a king, and he is coming for you." Merrick's grip on my hair tightened until I gasped. "The wolf? We saw your pet. He's currently a pile of ash on your porch, Lyra. No one is coming." He signaled to the guards, and the cage door groaned open. They dragged me out, my shackles clinking rhythmically against the stone floor as they led me toward the ritual chambers. But as we descended into the bowels of the mountain, a faint vibration started in the soles of my feet. It wasn't the machinery of the mine or the movement of the pack. It was a heartbeat, massive, rhythmic, and filled with a rage that could move mountains. He was coming. And God help the man who tried to stop him. Chapter 16. The Mirror of Betrayal. The air in the ritual chamber was stagnant, thick with the metallic scent of dried blood and the cloying sweetness of ceremonial incense. My shackles felt like anchors, pulling my wrists toward the cold stone floor as Merrick's voice bounced off the damp walls. He was chanting in a tongue that sounded like grinding rocks, a language of old power that made my skin itch with an unnatural heat. "Do you feel it, Lyra?" he whispered, his hand snake-like as it slid over my shoulder. "The ancestors are waking up. They've been waiting for a vessel that doesn't let the light distract her from the source." I didn't answer. I was focused on the vibration in the floor, a rhythmic thudding that was growing louder, faster, and more violent with every passing second. Then, the mountain itself seemed to scream. An explosion rocked the chamber, sending a shower of limestone dust over my hair and skin. Screams of terror erupted from the guards above, followed by the unmistakable wet tearing of flesh. The heavy iron doors at the top of the stairs didn't just open. They were ripped from their hinges, hitting the floor with a sound that signaled the end of the world. "He's here," I breathed, a spark of triumph lighting up my chest. I expected the wolf to burst through the dust, the silver protector who had shared my cabin and my silence. But the footsteps that descended the stairs were heavy, rhythmic, and human. A silence fell over the room so profound I could hear the drip of water from the ceiling. Marek let go of me, his breath hitching in a way that told me he was seeing a ghost. "No!" the Alpha stammered, his voice cracking like a dry twig. It can't be. The High Throne doesn't interfere with border pacts. The High Throne interferes wherever its queen is stolen," a voice boomed, echoing through the cavern with the weight of 1,000 storms. It was Kael, but it wasn't the soft, vulnerable voice of the man who had held me in the cabin. This was a voice of iron and ice, a kingly decree that demanded absolute submission. I felt a surge of confusion, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Queen? High Throne? My fingers gripped the edge of the sacrificial altar as the reality of his identity crashed over me like a tidal wave of freezing water. "You're the Alpha King," I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I didn't need eyes to see the truth now. The way he had moved, the power he had radiated, the way he had effortlessly dispatched the rogues, it wasn't just a protective wolf, it was a predator who had been playing a game. He hadn't stayed with me because he loved a broken Omega. He had stayed because he was a collector of rare things, and I was the legendary blind seer he needed for his own crown. The trust I had built, the secret I had shared. It was all just a pawn's move in a king's opening gambit.
Chapter 17. The Weight of the Crown. I stood at the base of the stairs, my royal cloak stained with the blood of the men who had tried to bar my way. My warriors were flooding the upper levels, systematically dismantling the northern reach, but my eyes were fixed only on Lyra. She looked so small against that altar, her face pale and streaked with dust, her sightless eyes turned toward me with an expression that cut deeper than any silver blade. I saw the moment the realization hit her, the moment the shadow in the woods became the tyrant on the throne. "Lyra, listen to me," I said, stepping toward her, my hand outstretched. Marek tried to scramble away, but one of my commanders pinned him to the wall before he could draw a breath. I didn't care about him. I only cared about the wall of ice that was rapidly rising between me and my mate. I am the king, yes, but I never lied about what I felt for you. The bond. It brought me to that forest before I ever knew who you were. It was a half-truth, a desperate plea for a mercy I didn't deserve. I had known of the prophecy, but the woman had eclipsed the legend the moment I saw her gather herbs in the rain. "Did you?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She stood up, her shackles clinking with a sound that felt like an accusation. "Or did you just want to make sure the seer didn't fall into the wrong hands? Was I just an asset you were guarding until the time was right to bring me to your palace?" Her words were sharp, clinical, and devoid of the warmth that had been my only solace for weeks. She wasn't the girl from the cabin anymore. She was a woman who had been betrayed by love twice, and I was the one who had dealt the final blow. "I stayed because I couldn't leave you," I roared, my frustration boiling over into a display of alpha dominance that made the guards in the room flinch. But Lyra didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her chin tilted up in defiance of a king she no longer trusted. "You stayed because you wanted to own me, Kael, just like Marek, just like my father. You just used a softer touch." The rejection hit me like a physical blow to the chest, a jagged tear in the mate bond that made my wolf howl in agony. She was pulling away, her heart closing its doors and bolting the locks. I watched as she reached out, her fingers finding the cold iron of her shackles. "Unlock them," she commanded, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that made my own blood sing, even as my heart broke. I signaled to my commander, and the chains fell to the floor with a heavy final thud. She didn't run to me. She didn't ask for protection. She simply turned her back on me, walking toward the exit of the chamber with a grace that made every man in the room bow their heads. I was the king of the Lycan territories, but in that moment, I realized I was the poorest man in the world.
Chapter 18. The Shadow of the Past. The mountain air was biting, but it felt clean compared to the suffocating lies of the ritual chamber. I walked through the wreckage of the Northern Reach stronghold, my feet finding the path through the rubble with an instinct born of sheer survival. Kael was behind me. I could feel his heat, hear the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart. But he didn't touch me. He knew better. He had won the war. He had crushed my enemies. And in doing so, he had proven that he was exactly the kind of man I had spent my life trying to avoid. "Where are you going, Lyra?" he asked, his voice low and shattered. We had reached the edge of the forest, the Blackroot stretching out before us like a dark, welcoming sea. I stopped, turning my head toward the sound of his breathing. "I'm going home," I said. "To the cabin, to the silence, to the life I had before a king decided to play at being a wolf." I felt a pang of regret, a sharp needle of longing for the way he had nudged my hand with his nose. But that memory was tainted now. Every touch had been a calculation. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the trees. It wasn't one of Kael's warriors. It was Marek, his face twisted in a mask of bloody desperation, a silver dagger clutched in his hand. He had escaped his captors, driven by a madness that only comes to an alpha who has lost everything. "If I can't have the seer, no one will," he shrieked, launching himself toward me. I didn't have time to move. I heard the whistle of the blade and the sudden, frantic rush of air as someone threw themselves in front of me. A heavy thud followed, the sound of a body hitting the earth and a sharp, pained gasp that I would know anywhere. "Kael!" I screamed, my hands searching the air until they found him. He was on the ground, his blood warm and sticky as it soaked into my dress. He had taken the silver blade meant for my heart. I felt the jagged hilt protruding from his side, the poison of the metal already leaching into his system. "Why?" I sobbed, pulling his head into my lap. "Why would you do this?" "Because," he gasped, his hand reaching up to find my face, his fingers trembling and cold. "Because I didn't stay for the seer, Lyra. I stayed for the girl who plucked the burrs from my fur." His breath was growing shallow, the mate bond vibrating with a final, desperate frequency. He was dying. The Alpha King was bleeding out in the dirt for a woman who had just rejected him. In that moment, the anger vanished, replaced by a terrifying, blinding clarity. He hadn't lied about the love. He had only lied about the crown. And now, I was about to lose both. Chapter 19. The Taste of Silver and Ashes. The world felt like it was dissolving into a cold, gray mist that had nothing to do with my blindness. I sat in the dirt, the sharp stones biting into my knees, but all I could feel was the terrifyingly fast pulse beneath Kael's skin. The silver dagger was a jagged tooth of poison buried in his side, and every time he gasped, I felt the vibration of his agony through my own chest. This wasn't the invincible king who had shattered the ritual chamber. This was a man who was bleeding out in the mud because he had chosen to be my shield instead of my master. "Kael, stay with me!" I shrieked, my fingers frantic as I tried to staunch the flow of blood with the hem of my tunic. The liquid was hot, far hotter than a human's, and it smelled of ozone and ancient power. I heard the scuffle of boots, Merrick trying to flee, followed by the sickening final thud of an executioner's blow from one of Kael's commanders. But the death of my enemy brought no satisfaction. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the man in my lap, his breathing becoming a series of shallow, wet rattles that tore at my soul. "Don't cry, little bird," Kael wheezed, his hand catching my wrist with a grip that was already losing its iron. I could feel the silver poison racing through his veins, a cold sludge that suppressed the healing magic of his alpha blood. He wasn't shifting, he couldn't. The metal was locking him in this fragile human state, forcing him to face death without the protection of the wolf. Why would he do it? Why would a man who owned the world throw it all away for a woman who had just spat on his name? "You're a fool," I sobbed, my tears falling onto his pale cheeks. "You lied to me. You manipulated the forest, and you brought a war to my door. You're supposed to be the villain of my story, Kael. You aren't supposed to die for me." I felt his lips curve into a weak ghost of a smile against my palm. "Then, I am a very bad villain," he whispered. The mate bond, which I had tried so hard to sever with my anger, suddenly flared to life, a blinding white cord of light that connected my heart to his. It wasn't a tether of control. It was a bridge of sacrifice. I realized then that I had been wrong about the nature of the bond. I thought it was a cage, a fate forced upon us by the moon. But as Kael's life force flickered like a candle in a gale, I saw the truth. The bond was an invitation. It was a choice to stand in the path of the blade, to bleed so the other could breathe. He had chosen me long before he knew I was a seer. He had chosen me when I was just a girl whispering to a shadow on a porch. And now, if I didn't choose him back, the darkness would take us both.
Chapter 20. The Gateway of the Blind. The pain was a living thing, a silver serpent coiling around my spine and squeezing the air from my lungs. I could hear the frantic rhythm of Lyra's heart, a beautiful, erratic drumming that was the only thing keeping me conscious. I wanted to tell her so many things, that the crown was a burden I would have traded for one more night by her hearth, that her blindness was the only light I had ever truly seen. But the words were heavy, like stones in my mouth, and the darkness was pulling at my heels, a cold tide that refused to be ignored. "I can't lose you," she whispered, her voice shifting. It wasn't the voice of a victim anymore. It was resonant, vibrating with a frequency that made the very air around us hum. I felt her hands move from my wound to my temples, her touch no longer trembling. A sudden, searing heat exploded behind my eyelids, a golden radiance that defied the silver poison. She was tapping into it, the ancestral power Merrick had craved, the legacy of the seers that had been buried under years of rejection and self-doubt. "Lyra, no," I tried to warn her, but the words were a mere puff of air. The power she was calling upon required a price, a blending of souls that could burn a lesser wolf to ash. But she didn't hesitate. I felt the silver in my blood begin to vibrate, the poison reacting to the sudden influx of her pure omega energy. She was hunting the venom, chasing it through my arteries with a focus that was terrifyingly precise. She didn't need eyes to see the sickness. She could feel the discord in the melody of my life. The world tilted. I felt the sensation of falling upward, a rush of wind and light that smelled of wild cedar and yarrow. We were in the between, the spiritual landscape where the mate bond was forged in fire. I saw her there, not as a blind girl in a dirt-stained dress, but as a goddess of the forest, her eyes glowing with the silver light of the full moon. She reached out, her hand closing around the jagged shard of silver that existed in my spirit, and with a scream of pure defiance, she shattered it. The transition back to the physical world was a violent jolt. I gasped, my lungs expanding with a sudden, delicious rush of air as the silver poison evaporated from my system. My wound began to knit together, the skin sealing over the jagged hole Marek had left behind. I opened my eyes to see Lyra slumped over me, her face pale and her breathing heavy. But she was alive. She had done the impossible. She had used the very defect the world hated to rewrite the laws of life and death.
Chapter 21. The Choice in the Clearing. The silence of the Blackroot had returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was a clean, expectant silence, like the forest was waiting for us to decide what happened next. I felt Kael's arms wrap around me, pulling me back into his heat, but this time, the touch didn't feel like a claim. It felt like a request. I sat back, my hands resting on his shoulders, feeling the raw, vibrant power of a king who had been reborn. He didn't speak. He waited, his breath hitching as I traced the new scar on his ribs. "You died for me," I whispered, the weight of the reality finally settling in my stomach. "You didn't do it for the seer. You didn't do it for the high throne. You did it for me." I felt him nod, his forehead coming to rest against mine. "The seer is a legend, Lyra. The high throne is a job. You are the reason I survived the silence of my own life." The sincerity in his voice was a physical thing, a warmth that melted the last of the ice around my heart. I looked toward the trees, or where I knew the trees were, and realized that the cabin was gone. The northern reach was broken, and the life I knew was a heap of smoldering ruins. I could go back to the isolation, find another corner of the world to hide in, and wait for the next alpha to come hunting for a prophecy. Or I could take the hand of the man who had bled in the dirt to prove that love wasn't a tether, but a choice. "I can't see the path ahead of us, Kael," I said, a small, sad smile touching my lips. "I don't know how to be a queen. I don't even know if I can trust a man who hides in the shadows for weeks." He laughed then, a rich, resonant sound that made the birds in the canopy take flight. "Then don't be a queen. Be Lyra. And as for the shadows, I promise to stay in the light, as long as you're the one holding the torch." I reached out, my fingers finding his jaw, and for the first time, I didn't just feel his face. I felt his soul. It was vast, complicated, and fiercely devoted. I leaned forward, my lips finding his in a kiss that tasted of salt, iron, and a future I was finally brave enough to want. The bond snapped into place, a permanent golden glow that didn't feel like a cage at all. It felt like wings. I had spent my life running from the dark, never realizing that the most beautiful things only grow when someone is brave enough to watch over them in the night. Chapter 22. The Crown of Thorns and Wildflowers. The air of the Blackroot Forest had changed. The cloying scent of blood and the electric ozone of Kael's transformation had been replaced by the crisp, cool aroma of damp pine and morning mist. I sat on a fallen log, my fingers tracing the velvet texture of a moss-covered rock, while behind me, the rhythmic sound of Kael's warriors clearing the wreckage of my cabin provided a strange, industrial percussion. It was over. The northern reach was a memory of smoke, their alpha's greed buried in the same dirt he had tried to claim as his own. but the silence that followed the war was the loudest thing I had ever heard. "They're waiting for us, Lyra." Kael's voice was a low vibration that seemed to travel through the ground before hitting my ears. I felt his presence long before his shadow fell over me, a radiant heat that acted as a compass for my sightless world. He didn't sound like a king issuing a decree. He sounded like a man who was afraid I might say no. I turned my head toward him, my fingers tightening around the small bundle of dried yarrow I had managed to salvage from the ruins of my porch. It was the only piece of my old life I had left. Waiting for the seer, or waiting for the girl who lived in the weeds? I asked, my voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in my stomach. I could feel the weight of 100 gazes on us. Kael's elite guard, the silver fangs who stood at the edge of the clearing like statues of iron. They had seen me heal their king with a power that shouldn't exist. They had seen an Omega command the elements of life and death. To them, I was a miracle, a holy relic to be polished and displayed in a golden cage at the Capitol. Kael knelt in the dirt before me, his heavy, calloused hands covering mine. He didn't try to pull me up. He simply existed there at my feet, a king offering his submission to a hermit. "They are waiting for their Luna," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "But I am only waiting for you. If you want to stay here in this forest, I will build you a palace of cedar and stone. I will move the capital to the Blackroot. I will turn the world upside down if it means I get to wake up to the sound of your breathing." I felt the sincerity in his bond, a golden cord that was no longer a tether of fate but a bridge of absolute devotion. He meant it. He would abandon his throne, his duties, and his heritage just to keep me in the silence I had spent years using as a shield. But as I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his, I realized that the silence was no longer enough. The girl who had hidden in the woods was gone, burned away in the fire of the ritual chamber. The woman who remained was something more, someone who knew that love wasn't about hiding from the world, but about having someone to walk through it with.
Chapter 23. The King's New Light. I watched Lyra's face, my heart hammering against my ribs with a violence I hadn't felt even in the heat of battle. I was the Alpha King, a man who had stared down usurpers and survived silver poison, yet I was terrified of the tiny, blind woman sitting on a log. She was the only person in the world who could truly hurt me, because she was the only one I had given my soul to without a contract or a crown. I saw the conflict in the tilt of her chin, the way her brow furrowed as she listened to the wind whispering through the trees of her sanctuary. "I won't be a seer in a glass box, Kael," she said finally, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity that made my wolf howl with pride. She stood up and I rose with her, my hands never leaving hers. "I won't be a political tool for your council, or a breeding prize for your lineage. If I go with you, I go as your equal. I go as the woman who chose you when you were nothing but a shadow on her porch. Do you understand what that means for your kingdom?" I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for a lifetime. "It means the kingdom finally has a heart, Lyra," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I leaned down, my lips brushing the top of her head. "The council will learn to fear your silence more than my roar. And as for the lineage, we will write our own story, one that starts with a girl who was too brave to stay broken." I signaled to my commander, and the royal carriage, a sturdy, obsidian-trimmed vessel, was brought forward. But Lyra didn't move toward the carriage. She turned back toward the deep woods, her hand reaching out as if to touch the spirit of the Blackroot one last time. "Goodbye, Shadow," she murmured, a small, secret smile lighting up her face. Then, she turned back to me, her sightless eyes glowing with the silver residue of the power she had used to save me. She reached for my arm, her grip firm and certain. "Take me home, Kael. But remember, I'm still the one who knows how to find the path in the dark." I led her toward the carriage, the silver fangs hitting their knees in a synchronized crash of armor that echoed like thunder through the valley. It was the first time they had bowed to someone other than me, and it would not be the last. As I helped her into the velvet interior, I looked back at the ruins of the cabin. The forest was already beginning to reclaim it, the vines crawling over the charred wood. The past was being buried, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking behind me. I had the sun in my arms, and the darkness of the world didn't stand a chance.
Chapter 24. The horizon beyond the dark. The journey to the capital was a blur of motion and sound, a sensory overload that would have broken me weeks ago. But with Kael's hand in mine, the world felt manageable. He described the landscapes as we passed, the jagged peaks of the Iron Mountains, the sprawling lavender fields of the western reaches, and finally, the white marble spires of the high throne. He spoke with a poet's tongue, painting a world of color and light for me until I could almost see the gold of the sun bouncing off the city gates. When we finally arrived, the roar of the crowd was a physical wave of heat. Thousands of wolves had gathered to see the king return with the legendary blind seer. I felt the tension in Kael's arm, his protective instinct flaring as he prepared to shield me from the scrutiny of the masses. But I stepped forward, my hand sliding from his arm to his hand, interlacing our fingers. I didn't want to be hidden. I wanted them to see that the woman they called broken was the one holding the hand of their king. We walked up the steps of the palace, the air smelling of jasmine and expensive incense. I could hear the whispers of the lords and ladies, the sharp, judgmental intake of breath as they realized I was still blind, still scarred, still an omega. But as we reached the top of the dais, Kael stopped. He didn't sit on his throne. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his voice amplified by the ancient magic of the hall. "You see a seer," he boomed, his power washing over the room like a tidal wave. "But you are looking at your queen, and she does not need eyes to see the truth of your hearts." A profound silence fell over the hall, followed by a slow, rising tide of cheers that shook the chandeliers. I felt Kael pull me closer, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was a declaration of war against the old ways. I was no longer the girl who slept alone in the forest. I was no longer the pariah who feared the sound of her own name. I was Lyra, the Luna of the High Throne, the woman who had found her sight in the heart of a wolf. Epilogue. Months later, I walked through the royal gardens, the scent of blooming roses heavy in the evening air. I moved with a confidence that didn't require a cane or a guide, my internal map of the palace now as detailed as my map of the Blackroot. I heard a familiar heavy tread behind me, the click of claws on stone. Kael had shifted, his massive silver wolf form a comforting presence in the twilight. He nudged my hand with his nose, his fur still smelling of the cedar and rain I had fallen in love with. "I know you're there," I laughed, scratching him behind the ears. He let out a low, contented rumble, his head resting on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, watching a sunset I couldn't see but could feel in the cooling air and the softening of the world's edges. I was still blind. The world was still a place of shadows and sharp corners. But as the first stars began to hum in the sky, I realized that I would never be alone in the dark again. I had chosen my shadow, and he had chosen his light.